That's a good thing.
Yeah, it's a good deal. Have you like thesis over the summer? Yeah. How'd it go? How was it?
I'll have to go and see if some emergency priority graduate students don't do anything.
They get a lottery too.
I don't know if it's a lottery.
Yeah, I don't think they decided.
Oh, congrats.
They are later.
Maybe I might as well begin. All right. Last time, you recall, what we did was we ran over what I call the setup of the original position. And by that I meant the items that are going over in sections 20 to 25, where one describes the nature of the argument for the two principles of justice, the beliefs and information and the motivation of the parties and so on, and the alternatives that they have available and all that. The idea being, of course, that if we know those things, and if we describe that information or the setup in the right way, then we should be able to work out, not at all in the technical fashion, but just in some intuitive, common sense way, which of the principles on the list the parties would agree to. It's the same thing as going to a market or something. You know what you want to buy and so forth, and how much you have and all that sort of stuff, and then you select something. If you describe what the agent of the household is aiming at, their beliefs and so on, well, then you can make some account of what it is they'll do. So it's the same idea, only, of course, this original position has moral elements in it, and therefore it has another purpose. But there's an aspect of it that is the same. Now, the thing I want to do today is to give a brief sketch, omitting a lot of things in sections 26 to 28, which is all I'm going to talk about. I won't talk about 29, actually, or 30. It's actually just a few things in 26 to 28, and I'm going to simplify that a good bit just to convey what I think is the main idea. So if the main idea is explained, then one ought to be able to handle more complicated cases later. Now, as is explained in section 25, and I might run over this, the argument for the two principles of justice is actually split into two parts. The first part is made on the presumption that the parties are rational and those that they represent are rational in the special sense that they're not swayed by what the text calls occasionally special psychologies. And in particular, the thing I'm concerned with here is that they're not swayed by envy. That is, envy is understood not as resentment, not as indignation, but just the desire to have what other people have if they have more than us. So that we are moved by envy if we would be better off if they had less. That's how envy is understood. we would be better off if they had less, that is, if they were made worse off. It's not necessarily pleasure in others' misfortune or others' loss, but it's a response somehow to the relations, and there could be examples of that. Whereas the opposite of that is spite, say, of those who have more, feeling worse off as those who have less have more. So it's the desire that people should stay far down there, not for moral reasons, but someone just simply has that desire. So what we're doing is abstracting from those kinds of motivations in the first part of the argument. Then there's a second part of the argument where in chapter 9, and in chapters 8 and 9, you discuss the question, and we can imagine that the parties are doing this, so we can always do that, whether the principles adopted in this first part specify a sufficiently stable conception of justice, where that means, among other things, and I did discuss in 8 and 9, it means, among other things, that in the well-ordered society, the institutions of a society like that, if they are well-ordered, and that means it will be satisfying the two principles, they do not cause or generate lots of envy between social groups, and on the other side of that, say perhaps spite, so that the institutions don't operate well, and in fact there is so much envy and so forth that the parties have to reconsider and perhaps adopt some other principles that could make envy less and make it, say, manageable. Now, today, only discussing the first part of the argument, ignoring the question of how these special psychologies, in particular envy, enter in. So I'm only talking about the part that's in sections 26 to 28. Now, much of the other part of the argument, as I say, is in part 3, in particular in chapters 8 and 9. I'll just tell you where it is. I don't think we'll have time to go over it. Now, I recall, as I mentioned the last time, I believe I did, that it says on page 147, and you have to keep this in mind, that the parties in the OP are theoretically defined individuals. That is, if they have only the features that we, that is you and me, who are setting up the OP and trying to develop a notion of justice that is based on this idea that society is a system of fair cooperation between free and equal persons and so forth and so on. They have only the features that we ascribe to them for this purpose. So that one ought not to think of the way the parties are described as an attempt to describe our moral experience in any interesting way. It's not as if we were trying to give an account of our experience as autonomous people. We're not doing that. We're ascribing to them attributes in this construction which is designed to reflect certain things, designed to be a fair situation. And they have the attributes that's reasonable for us to attribute to them in view of that objective. If we were trying to describe the phenomenology of a moral experience or the nature of it as autonomous or free beings and so forth, we would see it in a different way. And so the account of the parties isn't intended to do that. Well, that's just kind of a preliminary remarks. Now, let's move on to another point. the way in which the argument actually proceeds for the two principles of justice is by various two-way comparisons, by which I mean that we take the two principles and we compare them with other alternatives on the list. And if we had a list, say, of 5 alternatives, then we would compare it with each alternative on the list, and if, say, the two principles won, then that would conclude the argument with respect to that list. Now we could always enlarge the argument by putting other alternatives on the list. And in principle, of course, the argument goes on, I suppose, in some sense forever, although any given time the plausible alternatives are more or less finite, so that we might be able at any rate to come to some sort of a provisional conclusion by going through the more important alternatives. And that's what is done. Now, the first comparison that I'll discuss, and I think it would have been better in the book if these two comparisons had been separated and it'd be clear the way the argument was presented, which was being done at any particular time. But the first and most fundamental comparison is to run the two principles against the principle of average utility. Just that comparison. And I think of that as the most fundamental one because the presumption is, although one might dispute this, that principle of average utility is more plausible than the classical principle, which is discussed in sections 5 and 6, and then again in section 30. And the contrast between the average and the classical is discussed in section 27. So what the average principle says is that the institutions are to be designed in such a way that, or I should say the institutions of the basic structure should always be, we're talking about that, we're thinking of these as first principles. The institutions of the basic structure are to be designed so as to maximize the average utility, that is the utility, as it were, per capita, of the members of society, beginning now and on into the future. That is, you include future possibilities in this calculation, at any rate from a philosophical standpoint, however hard it might be to do that. So that's what the average principle says, and it is discussed in section 20, so I don't think I'll elaborate on it further here. When we come to Mill next week, I shall talk about it some more and consider what kind of a principle Mill holds as far as the time allows, but I'll pass over it now. Now, the reason that this comparison is the most fundamental is because of the aim of TJ. The aim of TJ is to, first of all, define some alternative that seems more plausible than, better than, or superior to the dominant utilitarianism of our tradition of political thought. I'm thinking, of course, of the English tradition mainly. It's not correct to say it would be dominant on the continent, but we're thinking of the English tradition. We want to find something superior to that, if possible, and something which also is or provides a better moral basis for the institution of a democratic society. So if in this first comparison the two principles are superior to the principle of average utility and seem to us on reflection be a better moral basis for the institutions of a democratic society, then actually to considerable extent the aim of TJ is already achieved. We've already shown something And that's what I would like to emphasize, even though there may be other principles that are superior to the two principles of justice. Presumably, they're going to share some of the features that the two principles have in contrast with the principle of average utility. From now on, I'll drop the term average and just presume I'm talking about average as opposed to classical utility. So any principle that would be superior to the two principles presumably shares certain basic features of those principles in common as opposed to principle of utility. I haven't given any argument for that. That just somehow seems kind of plausible a priori. Perhaps it's a priori pious probable conjecture, maybe something like that almost. Another advantage of beginning with this comparison is that it shows reasonably clearly in a fairly simple case how these arguments go. And therefore there's some point in beginning with it. The second fundamental comparison, which I'll not discuss today, and hope to be able to get to after Marx or sometime in there, and to postpone a bit to things that I would like to have gotten to sooner. But in any case, the second fundamental comparison is a comparison in which one substitutes for the difference principle the principle of utility subject to some constraint, that is, certain social minimum to be maintained. So with this comparison, the first principle of justice and principle of fair or equal opportunity are already adopted. So they're taken for granted. So what we're doing then is just running in effect against the same background institutions, the principle of average utility against the difference principle. And in order to make it even harder for the difference principle, we constrain, if you like, if you think that helps, the principle of average utility by some kind of social minimum. Now that's going to be a much